Oh, hi. Welcome to Aquata Zoo, where we like to nerd out over all things zoo and aquarium related. I'm l.semple, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Parthenogenesis. I know, it's quite a mouthful, right? I don't know if you've ever heard that word said out loud. I will say that this is something more that we deal with typically in aquariums more than zoos, but it does happen in zoos as well. It happens with particular types of animals, and I saw a story about it again this week. It was a huge topic this time last year in 2024, around January 2024, somewhere in there. And so I feel like I should just go over this again. I've mentioned it previously, but not necessarily had an entire episode on it. I didn't necessarily think that it was something that people cared about so much, but I keep seeing it in the news. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it. Parthenogenesis. What is it? This is when an animal, typically a fish, a elasmobranch especially, so the sharks and rays. There's some reptiles that can do this, but basically they can use their own genetics and make a copy of it and essentially produce offspring using only their genetics. Now, depending on the type of animal that we're talking about, that influences how this works. But it is possible for some animals to reproduce without having ever been with another animal of the opposite sex. So even though we typically think about there needing to be a couple of parents here and that they need to mix up their genetics and that kind of thing, that is not always the case. And so in the zoo and aquarium world, it gets a little complicated when you realize that you've got an animal that's about to produce pups, offspring, what have you, and you were not prepared for that because that animal hasn't been with another animal of the opposite gender in years or perhaps ever. And so we just have to be ready to deal with that sometimes. And so that's what I'm talking about. This is a phenomenon called parthenogenesis, and it has made some headlines in recent years. Now, your average non-biology student doesn't really know that this is a thing, so it doesn't really shock me that people read about this or hear about it and they're really fascinated, because humans don't do this, as far as I know, and mammals in general don't do this, but this is an odd situation. Well, watch, now I feel like this is something that a platypus could do for some reason, right? They're so strange. But anyway, as far as I know, as of the recording of this episode, mammals don't do this. And it only happens with certain types of reptiles and certain types of fish. And I'm sure there's other lower taxa that do this as well. And it's kind of, I assume, something of a reproductive strategy that will help the species in general, usually, but not always. So if you've got a female who's wandering around by herself and maybe can't find a male or doesn't want to be with the males, then she may take her own DNA and produce offspring anyway and just say, that's it, I'm doing this alone, and produce some babies that are essentially genetic copies of herself. And that is a thing that some animals can do. There are several species of sharks that can do this. There's some species of rays that can do this. Komodo dragons can do this, which is kind of interesting. So there's some reptiles that do it as well. And so it's a weird reproductive strategy, but it does keep the line going, I guess. Your genetics are still out there, which is neat. I will say that it does get a little weird in some species. I don't think it's all of them that do this, but in a lot of cases, the offspring of the singular parent oftentimes tend to be sterile. So they are not going to be reproducing on their own. Or if they do, it's almost like their genes are a little bit off. Have you ever taken a piece of paper with the writing on it and made copies of it, and then you make a copy of the copy, and then you make a copy of the copy of the copy? And how things get a little weird the more copies of copies you've got going on. Like, I feel like it's something like that. Don't quote me on that. This is genetics, which is totally different. And genetics is wild and will do crazy things sometimes. But a lot of the time, the offspring of the animal that has copied itself does not reproduce. Now, for the record, that is not always the case, but the ones that I've seen, they tend to have a little bit more trouble reproducing. It's not the end of the world. It's not that they necessarily can't or won't all the time, but it depends on the type of animal. It depends on the genetics that were passed down. And, it's possible that they could reproduce, but a lot of these animals that are produced essentially asexually, which means just, one animal did that. They sometimes can't reproduce or don't reproduce for whatever reason. And I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the reasons that this happens, but a lot of the time, the offspring of that singular parent tend to not reproduce. So it is an unexpected and strange method of passing on genetics, right? Like, I would take a bunch of mini-me's. They could help me get so much work done. It would be amazing. And we'd all have the same sense of humor, I assume. So that would be great. But I don't do that as far as I know. So I guess I won't be having parthenogenic offspring. So, but it is interesting, especially when you're a zookeeper or an aquarist. This kind of thing happens from time to time. We just have to be ready for it. If you're working with species that are known to kind of do this, or species adjacent to the type that kind of do this, you have to be ready, right? And I've been there for several times when we were not ready. It's not something that you think of all the time. And in some cases, it's because an animal was in a zoo or aquarium that we know that they can do this. Because they were on exhibit, happily, walking around, swimming around, whatever, for years and years. And that was the singular animal that we had of that species. And all of a sudden, now there's two. Like, it's not something that you're automatically expecting. And especially if it's in a species that you did not know could do that. It's not a necessarily miracle. I hate using that word. It's got religious overtones to it, and that's not really, at least how I view this. Some people do, and more power to them, but this is a somewhat natural situation that happens. The animal has elected to do this. The genetics are exactly the same as the parent, and you usually test the genetics when this happens between the parent and the offspring so that you can tell. If that's like a carbon copy of that parent's offspring or of that parent's genes, then you know that this was a parthenogenic event, and that is now a species that does that, apparently. So, like I said, I saw this come up in another news article recently, and they were saying how the keepers, it was an animal in an aquarium, they were saying that the keepers were baffled. And I'm like, I read that and I was like, you shouldn't be baffled, because we all know this can happen. And I'm not saying that all zoos and aquariums are at the same level of expertise or knowledge or experience. That's not what I'm saying, but I would hope that when an aquarium or zoo has a species in their collection, that they would do some research about that species, and that in the midst of that research, when learning how to take care of it, what kind of diet they need, what kind of space they need, the life cycle, how all that works, different stages of life and all that kind of stuff. That's the type of stuff that we research ahead of time before we get these animals, right? And I would hope that before they got the animal that ended up reproducing in a parthenogenic way, that they would have come across that information somehow, and that they would be familiar with the fact that maybe they didn't know that species exactly did that, but they would know that it has been documented that maybe some other species in the group, maybe the same genus, does that. In this case, yes, they would have known. They should have known that this animal can reproduce parthenogenically, and that it is not necessarily quote unquote baffling. This is a thing that does happen. I assume it does happen in the wild as well. We would just never know about it just because those animals are in the wild and nobody's necessarily watching them and what they're doing and how they're reproducing. So that is kind of helpful that we've got them in zoos and aquariums, because we never would have learned this little fun fact about certain animals, that the fact that they can reproduce on their own without the genetic input of another animal, like that's pretty cool. And we wouldn't have known that if we weren't keeping them in zoos and aquariums as ambassadors so that people can learn new things about them. When this first started happening, when animals were comfortable enough to start reproducing, and then we also had the testing ability to verify that yes, this is a genetic exact copy of the parent, we're learning more. We understand more about that animal, its species, its reproductive strategies, and that sort of thing. Now, there are also animals that store genetic material from another animal for long periods of time. So you never know if it's necessarily that, oh, that animal was in contact with a male like 3 years ago, if they might have held on to that male's genetic material for a really long time, because some people, or some animals, not some people, some animals can do that. And they can hold on to genetic material for quite some time and it remains viable and everything's fine. Probably not 3 years. I feel like that's a little long, but you never know. The point is that they could hang on to genetic material and decide when to use it. So there are also animals that do that. So that's how we know through blood testing or genetic testing from the parent and the offspring, whether this is a parthenogenic event where there was one parent that produced all of the genetic material to put into that offspring, or if it's a case of an animal holding on to genetic material from a male that they saw however long ago and just decided to now use it, which is also a really cool thing that animals can do sometimes. Not all animals can do that either. But there are some animals who just hold on to that genetic material from an encounter that they had long ago. And then they just decide, like, okay, I'm ready to have my offspring now. And so they put it to use, and suddenly they've got completely viable offspring. Surprise. Surprise offspring for those of us who are caring for those animals. It happens sometimes. But it's really cool to learn about how these animals can reproduce, what strategies they have for reproducing, because there may be times where they don't encounter another animal of their species for long periods of time. Yeah, it would make sense that they could just then produce parthenogenically or produce by holding on to genetic material of another animal for when they're ready, right? Because not all of us are ready immediately upon meeting someone else, right? So sometimes it just takes time. Animals may operate the same way, but the point is that these strategies exist, that we know about them now. It's really cool, but it should not necessarily be baffling to the people who are taking care of the animal. Now, the general public, I totally understand. If you're not a biologist, you probably don't know that this kind of stuff happens, and there's lots of other reproductive strategies as well. I don't want to pretend like these are the only ones. That's not the case. But they are two pretty cool ones. But I wouldn't expect the general public to understand parthenogenesis or to recognize that that's what's going on when an animal who has not been in contact with another animal of the opposite sex for years or possibly ever can still produce offspring. And so that's where we come in as zoo and aquarium educators, I guess, just giving them the resources and the knowledge that they need. It does happen. And when it does happen in a zoo or aquarium, it's cool to show off what happened. Like, that's kind of neat. And it does give us an opportunity to educate more people about what's going on in the animal world and this interesting quirk that they have, this interesting ability that they have. It opens the door to get people to understand how awesome animals are and why they need our help sometimes to be protected and to make sure that they are able to do these things in the natural habitat. And it also helps us stress the importance of zoos and aquariums, because again, if we did not have these animals in zoos and in aquariums and they were not acting as ambassadors for their wild counterparts for us all to learn about and see those cool behaviors and things, we never would have known that animals were capable of doing something like this. Where I have issue is more sometimes when facilities, zoos and aquariums tend to exploit this, and it's an easy way to grab headlines and to get eyes on your facility. And like I said, it happened last year around this time, and it was kind of a mess for the facility that happened to, because they got people who were super interested and super devoted to figuring out what was going on, but they were marketing it more like a miracle, which I guess is your prerogative, and it kind of is, but it's also a scientific observed situation that does occur in nature. So I'm personally hesitant to call it something like a miracle because, again, it's got some religious undertones that I think are a little unnecessary and perhaps misleading to people who are looking for miracle type situations. And so yeah, it's a slippery slope, I will say, right? Because now you've got an animal that has maybe reproducing, and it's marketed as a miracle. It's kind of clickbaity in that way, and people get really invested, and then it might turn out that something else is going on. So in the case that happened last year, it was an animal that actually needed veterinary care, and it was assumed that there was a quote unquote miracle happening, but that animal needed veterinary care, and as far as I can tell, didn't get it. It was something that we, a lot of us in the aquarium world at least, were following pretty closely, and the issue that was pretty glaring to those of us who have worked with the species or species similar to that, we're a little bit more concerned about the health of that animal because of the tendencies of the species, right? Like, we know that they have reproductive issues, and yes, it might look like an animal is carrying offspring, but that's not what's actually happening. That animal needs to be seen by a veterinarian. There's some abnormal swelling happening, but it does look like they're carrying offspring, right? And so the rest of us in the aquarium world were kind of concerned about what was happening because it was being marketed by the facility as a miracle, as an astonishing, never before seen kind of situation. But then we in the aquarium field at large were thinking, oh, this is probably a parthenogenic event because the animal was singly housed with no others of its species, or it needs medical assistance. Either one of those is viable, and that's okay. Just make sure that you've got a veterinarian involved either way to make sure that that pregnancy goes okay, that the offspring comes out healthy or whatever, that the development is good. And just like people, we're trying to monitor to make sure that everything's going smoothly, that there's no problems that we didn't anticipate, that if we need to have a medical intervention, that is an option, that kind of thing, right? This facility tended to not heed those warnings from the rest of the aquarium world, and we all kind of had to sit by and watch as the perceived parthenogenic event that was marketed as a miracle did not happen. And it turned out that yes, that animal needed some veterinary care. It was not carrying any offspring, but that was kind of wishful thinking, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it just needed a veterinarian. And so there was a lot of talk around that time about what this miracle, quote unquote, was, and how it was to be handled. And then as people got more invested in such a cool story, because it is cool, if you've got a parthenogenic event where an animal is basically making a carbon copy of itself and it just gives birth on its own, like, that's really neat. It happens in the animal world, and it's just kind of cool to know that animals can do that and how it works. And so rather than taking the time to educate people on exactly what was happening or what they were assuming was happening, they kind of just marketed it as a miracle situation that's never been seen before in this species. And while it may be true that it's not been seen in that species, it's been seen in that genus. And so you can assume that they kind of operate similarly, which is why they're in the same genus. And so that was a little disappointing. If you were in the aquarium world at that time, watching this all play out, it was kind of frustrating to watch happen because it was marketed in a very clickbait kind of way, and that was not necessary. And I feel like it kind of impacted negatively the reputation of aquariums specifically. Because it seemed like we didn't know what we were doing and that we didn't understand science. Which is generally not the case. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect and we understand all science. I don't think anybody does. But, in this case, we were kind of aware of what was going on without, or as best we could, without actually getting our hands on the animal and getting a veterinarian in there to verify what was going on without, some testing and whatnot. So when I saw the story, a similar story kind of pop up again, and it really claimed that the aquarium and, science is baffled and that kind of thing, I was really disappointed all over again. Because that is not the case. We know what's going on. And basically, this facility had an elasma break that lays eggs. And when you have eggs involved, you kind of can tell whether they're fertilized or not by various different methods. And it's usually by candling. You can just kind of look inside of it through the casing in this particular instance and see a developing pup, right? Or a developing yolk inside. So they knew that this egg case was developing, which is fine. And then it hatched. And that's great. You have a healthy little pup. That's awesome. And then, at least as a part of the article that I was reading about it, which was in kind of national news type situation, they were painting this as kind of an unknown scientific mystery sort of deal. Not necessarily going so far as to say miracle like the other one, but just to say that scientists had no idea what was going on, which is not the case. Even in this particular species, we may not have seen it before. I'm pretty sure we have. That one seemed pretty familiar to me, but to paint it in this sort of mystery-ridden way where you're trying to get people to kind of click on stories and things, it's just a little misleading. That's why I kind of wanted to bring this up. So if you see a facility that claims they've got an animal that's never been, usually it's with a male, they've never been with a male before, or they haven't been in years and years, and this is crazy how it could reproduce anyway. It's not exactly that crazy, depending on the type of animal. Now, if I see a mammal do this, that's going to be crazy. That's going to be a wild moment. You never know. I don't want to say never, because science is wild, and as they say in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. So but there are certain types of animals, usually the lower taxa a little bit, the less fancy than the birds and mammals and things. Those are the types that will be a little bit more prone, depending on the situation, to be able to reproduce in this way. And it is cool. I don't want to downplay that, and it's super interesting to learn about. And it is something that we do have to be aware of when we're dealing with animal care. And so not necessarily all of our animals can do that, but we need to be aware of the ones that we know can and be ready in case we have some that do it that we were not aware could do it. I worked at a facility at one point where we had an animal that actually passed on that we did not know they were going to reproduce in this way. And yes, we vaguely knew that they could, but we didn't think that this one was going to do that for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, lo and behold, several months later, after that animal had passed on, we found a clutch of eggs. And there were little babies in there. Amazing. And it was not due to that animal mating with a male. It was just because she had decided at one point that she was going to reproduce, and she did so. And so it can surprise you even when you know that it's a possibility, right? And so it's really cool. I'm not trying to say that it's not really cool, but I don't like when it's exploited for clickbait on the internet. And then people are kind of twisting it with religious undertones, and saying that, it's a miracle, totally unexplained, touched by, some otherworldly entity, that kind of thing. That gets under my skin a little bit because, we pride ourselves as zoos and aquariums on being understanding of science. And at least being able to sort of explain what's going on, even though it might be way above our heads. Like, I know that I'm not explaining parthenogenesis perfectly, but just now that it is a case where some animals can reproduce on their own without any other extra genetic material. They do a copy of themselves and produce a smaller version of themselves, right? In generally natural ways. We wouldn't have known it without zoos and aquariums, I don't think, because these animals wouldn't have been comfortable enough to do so if we weren't trying to make their situation as naturalistic as possible. And suddenly they feel like they're ready to reproduce, and we might not have the other sex in there. So they just decide to do it on their own. Okay. I guess they can do that. But our communication about that kind of thing needs to be very clear and help people understand how cool these animals really are. So I don't necessarily want people to throw their hands up in the air and say, I don't know how that happened, that's crazy. And then walk away, and that's the end of the story. I don't want them also to say that this animal has been touched by a deity and now they have an immaculate offspring, right? Like, that seems misleading as well. So I know that most zoos and aquariums, at least AZA accredited zoos and aquariums, depend heavily on science. And we try to explain what's going on when these kind of events happen. And is it cool? Yes. Do we want to talk about it? Absolutely. Because it's an interesting thing that some animals can do, and we don't know necessarily why, right? Like I said, a lot of these offspring tend to not reproduce on their own. So, I mean, not on their own as in parthenogenesis, but reproduce with a partner down the road. It could be that they could also reproduce their own genetic material and keep the line going as a carbon copy, which is wild. I feel like there would be a lot more chance for issues genetically if that happens, because making a copy of a copy of a copy is a difficult process and there's a lot of room for error, right? But regardless, it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's an interesting survival strategy for a species. So it's not necessarily that individual, but the whole species as an entire entity could continue their line and continue having their genetic material out there if they reproduce in whatever way they can. And if they don't have another option or don't choose another option, they have this method. And that's a really interesting thing that happens. It's been documented in many different types of animals now, and it's just something that occasionally happens in zoos and aquariums, and we want to educate the public about it because it is a cool science thing. And I just hope that facilities and news outlets, honestly, stop making it so clickbaity and trying to get eyes on their stories and, get traffic to their websites and things, right? So just in the future, if you see a story about an animal that reproduced in a zoo or aquarium without a partner to do so, just understand what's going on and look into the science of it. It's really interesting. Parthenogenesis is a very common way that this happens, and it is a cool thing that some animals can do, and it's unpredictable as to when they decide to do that, but they can. It is an option, and they can continue reproducing even though they don't have a partner in that endeavor, and they just have the one set of genes, and that's what they roll with, and it's okay. Some animals can do that. Don't fall susceptible to the hype and the clickbait and the blowing out of proportion or religious undertones and all that stuff. Just know that parthenogenesis is a thing. It's really cool. Some animals can do it, and it's worth looking into from a scientific standpoint. Okay, if you have any questions about that or any other zoo or aquarium things or leadership and management stuff, feel free to write it up in an email and send it to me at aquatazoo@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, and I hope that you do, don't forget you can follow or subscribe on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get all of that sweet, sweet content as soon as it releases. If you're feeling so inclined and you want to write a nice review or a rating, you can do that on your podcast player of choice as well. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can find me at patreon.com/aquatazoo. And if you're looking to take a vacation and you don't know where to start, I can help you out. I happen to be a personal vacation advisor with Magical Vacation Planner, and I would love to help you. It does not cost you anything extra. The links are in the show notes. Okay, thanks for listening. I heart your faces. Okay, bye.